In 1913, a Chicago meatpacking company started making tennis rackets out of leftover slaughterhouse guts. A century later, that same company's rackets would sit in the hands of Sampras, Federer, and Serena Williams, combining for over 100 Grand Slam titles between them. This is how Wilson accidentally became the most dominant name in tennis. So here's the real question. A company that started by melting down animal byproducts had no business becoming a tennis equipment dynasty. Did Wilson actually engineer that outcome, or did it just get lucky, decade after decade, with the right player picking up the right racket at the right time? To answer that, you have to go back to where this company actually started, and it has nothing to do with tennis. Chapter 1. The Byproduct Empire. In 1913, a meatpacking company called Sulzberger & Sons needed somewhere to send the leftover parts of the animals it processed. Tendons, intestines, connective tissue, waste, essentially. So it opened a subsidiary in Chicago called the Ashland Manufacturing Company, named after the street the factory sat on. By 1914, Ashland had figured out that those leftover materials made excellent surgical sutures, and also, strangely, excellent violin strings, and also tennis racket strings. That's not a metaphor. The same processing line that supplied operating rooms with sutures was stringing tennis rackets. Within a year, the company had expanded into baseball shoes and, almost as an afterthought, actual tennis rackets. In 1915, the parent company brought in a hard-nosed executive named Thomas E. Wilson to run the operation. Wilson saw something his bosses didn't, that sporting goods, not meat byproducts, was the real business. He broke the company off from its meatpacking parent, and in 1916, he put his own name on the door. That's the entire origin. Not a tennis visionary, not a racket engineer. A meatpacking executive who happened to notice that Americans were starting to spend money on leisure and sport, and that his factory already had the raw materials and machinery to supply it. Rackets, at this point, were a side business, one line among caddy bags, knitting mill acquisitions, and baseball gear. Nobody at Wilson in 1920 would have predicted that this company's name would eventually be etched into the frame of more Grand Slam winning rackets than any other manufacturer on Earth. But rackets were still an afterthought. The real turning point wouldn't come for another 50 years, when Wilson made a bet that changed the sport forever. Chapter 2. The Steel Gamble. For 50 years after Wilson's founding, every serious tennis racket on Earth was made of wood. Laminated ash, usually. That was simply what a racket was. In 1953, French tennis legend René Lacoste designed something completely different. A racket frame made of stainless steel, strung not through drilled holes but through a series of small metal loops. Wilson picked up the design and released it in 1967 as the T2000. It looked strange. It sounded strange when it hit the ball. Most of the tour hated it. Two players didn't. Billie Jean King and Clark Grabner played the T2000 at the 1967 U.S. Nationals at Forest Hills, and King became the first player ever to win a Grand Slam with a metal racket. But the player who actually made the T2000 legendary was a teenager who saw a test model and told his mother he had to have it.
I heard it when I was down in Florida at a young age. I said, I got to have that racket. It really made my career.
Connors used that racket for 18 years, into the 1980s, long after Wilson had moved on to newer designs. 3 Grand Slam titles with a piece of stainless steel that most of the sport considered a gimmick. What Wilson had actually proven wasn't that steel was better than wood. It was something more important, that players would trust a completely foreign material if it gave them an edge, and that a manufacturer willing to look ridiculous for a decade could end up owning the racket of a generation. Steel proved rackets could be reinvented. But the next material Wilson bet on would be even riskier, and it would define the next 40 years of tennis. Chapter 3. The Composite Era. By the early 1980s, wood and steel were both becoming obsolete. Wilson's engineers started experimenting with something almost nobody outside aerospace and the military was using yet. A braided combination of graphite and Kevlar, the same aramid fiber used in body armor. That construction first appeared in a Wilson catalog in 1983. It became the Pro Staff. A teenage Pete Sampras picked up the Pro Staff 85 and never switched. Not once for his entire professional career, 14 Grand Slam singles titles, an open-era record at the time he retired. Stefan Edberg, Chris Evert, Steffi Graf, Jim Courier, all Pro Staff. And then, a generation later, a young Swiss player named Roger Federer picked up the same racket his childhood heroes had used.
Playing with the Pro Staff reminds me of my heroes, Stefan Edberg and Pete Sampras. They played with it. I played with it when I was young. And now I can't wait to play with it myself.
That's not sentimentality. That's a direct material and design lineage running from 1983 to a racket Federer was still using in 2020, inspired, in his own words, by the original Pro Staff 6.0. Add it up across every player who ever picked up a Pro Staff, and you get a number that sounds almost fake. 117 combined Grand Slam titles won with a single racket family. By the 2000s, Wilson wasn't just making equipment for champions anymore. It was making the equipment that made champions possible, in a completely different part of the game. Chapter 4. The Widebody Revolution. In 1987, Wilson's engineers ran into a problem. Players wanted more power, but making a racket stiffer usually meant finding a stiffer material, and they'd already maxed out what graphite and Kevlar could do. So instead they changed the shape. The Wilson profile was the first wide-body racket in tennis. A frame 39 millimeters wide at the head, more than double the width of a classic wooden frame. You didn't need exotic new materials to add power. You just needed more frame between the strings and the player's hand. The profile itself faded from the pro game by the mid-90s, but the idea didn't. Almost every racket sold today, recreational or professional, is wider than the pre-profile standard. Wilson's own Pro Staff line absorbed the wide-body concept into what they called the dual taper system, and this is where the story splits. Instead of chasing one racket for every player, Wilson started building different frames for different games entirely. The classical, small-head Pro Staff for control players, the blade for spin-heavy modern baseliners, the Clash for players who wanted flexibility and feel over raw stiffness.
Everybody was going to bigger rackets, so I thought I had to fit in. There was a difference. I worked with Wilson trying to make something for me that was similar to the T2000, that worked a little bit with me, gave me a little trampoline effect.
That clip is from 1984, Connors describing Wilson literally trying to engineer a racket around one player's game. That instinct never went away. It's the same instinct behind Federer co-designing the RF97 decades later, and it's the same instinct behind Wilson's current lineup, which no longer tries to make one perfect racket, it tries to make the perfect racket for whoever's holding it, which raises the real question. With all this innovation, steel, composite, wide-body, personalization, is the racket actually why these players won? Or did Wilson just get lucky, over and over again, that its equipment happened to be in the right hands? Chapter 5. The Verdict. Here's the case for luck. Wilson didn't invent tennis, didn't invent steel, didn't invent graphite, didn't invent Kevlar. Every material shift came from outside the sport. Wilson just happened to be the company willing to bolt those materials onto a tennis frame first. Here's the case against luck. That's not one lucky break. That's the same decision, made correctly 5 separate times across 100 years, steel in 1967, composite in 1983, wide-body in 1987, personalization with Federer in the 2000s, and specialization into blade, Clash, and Pro Staff today. A company doesn't get lucky 5 times in a row. It builds a system. And that system runs on a simple loop. A champion wins with a Wilson racket. That win sells rackets to millions of amateurs who want to play like their hero. Those sales fund the next round of R&D. That R&D produces the next racket, the one the next champion picks up. Start to finish, that loop runs from a Chicago Slaughterhouse byproduct company in 1913 to 117 Grand Slam titles on one racket family alone. Not an accident, a flywheel, one that just happened to start spinning in the unlikeliest place imaginable. So maybe the real question isn't whether Wilson got lucky. It's whether any equipment company can build that same flywheel again, or whether tennis already handed out its one shot at this a century ago, and nobody's noticed since. Let me know in the comments which Wilson racket you grew up playing with. If you're new here, subscribe. This is Smart Tennis.